Okay, guys, we're going to get it started with chapter 15. I'm going to break it up. Chapter 15 and 16 I put usually together, and we do it all in one, one half of the part exam 4 session. But I'm going to break it up into 2 small videos, one for chapter 15, one for chapter 16. Now, regardless of the chapter, the biggest advice I can give for you for these 2 chapters on the global environment is the questions in the back of the study guide are good. He has them verbatim on the exam sometimes. You may see the exact question, maybe the change of the order of the multiple choice answers, but the exact question may be on there for the exam. Usually, I think there's like 30 or 40 questions total in the back of the study guide between 15 and 16. About 12 to 15 of them you might see on the exam. Now that's usually in a 50 question exam. So you got to take it for what that's worth in terms of that. With a 25 question exam, you maybe only see 5 or 6. But if you know that stuff in the back of the study guide, you're going to get some freebies. Usually you don't see a lot of those on the exam, maybe an occasional one, modified or storyline scenario that's modified a little bit. Here, there's more exact questions. That is the biggest thing besides going through all this material that I could say for the exam for chapters 15 and 16. It's unlike any other chapter other than maybe chapter 11, but chapter 11 usually only has 1 to 2 questions on it anyway. All right, we're going to start on the study guide, page 373 for part 2 of your part 2 packet. That would be the green one. There's a couple of charts on the back. One chart on the back that you've already filled out, 2 of them for chapter 14. We have 1 for chapter 15, 16, and then we're going to make our own another one for chapter 16 as well when it comes to things. And those 4 charts between 14, 15, and 16 are going to help you tremendously. That plus the questions in the back of the study guide, and just going over that information, knowing the little itty bitties in terms of environmental law and the acronyms and stuff like that, and where all the little terms are in chapter 14, fines and jail times and stuff like that is going to be big time for this exam. All right. For chapter 15, the global marketplace and the global environment, some of it's statistics, some of it's general stuff, some of it's a couple of definitions. It's straightforward if you know the right stuff to worry about. The first thing we have is the gross domestic product on page 373 of your study guide. I talked about it being about 70 trillion in 2011, going up and up and up, and stuff like that at a higher pace. Then you have the EU, all 27 member nations at the time. There's now 28, I would note that. But the EU makes up about 25% or 1/4 of the world's GDP. Add in the US is about a fifth, 21%. China being the largest communist nation at 10%, Japan at 8%. You have India as well, but those are the statistics. Statistics-wise, I think you need to know the EU, US, and Japan as a collective triad, so to speak, equates for about 55% of the world's GDP. You add in Canada, that makes what we call the Quad, which has been a test question. The triad is the EU, US, and Japan. Quad, adding Canada, adds maybe another 0.5%. So it's still around 55, 56% total. All right. The next thing we need to talk about is on the next page over in your study guide on emerging markets. You have Brazil, Russia, India, and China. What you need to know for test purposes on each of these is there's been a question on each one of these. Brazil, usually with the computer market, we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But Brazil, China being the largest communist nation in the world with quite a bit of domestic foreign direct investment. India is the largest, in terms of population, the largest democracy in the world. And they went from an import substitution growth strategy, which we'll talk more about in chapter 16, and they moved on from there to a more open door policy in regards to their system of economics in terms of global. The Russia portion, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The Russia portion is basically on page 375 of your study guide. What's the difference between Yeltsin and Putin in terms of Russia? And that is that B, 7B1 to the A, B, and C right there. But if you look at Yeltsin, Yeltsin had problems with corruption, tax collection system, the military, the police, and stuff like that, and couldn't really get a lot of foreign direct investment. Now, we'll talk about foreign direct versus foreign portfolio investment and what the U.S. system is a little bit later on, but understand they weren't able to attract a lot of foreign direct investment as well. The political instability under both Yeltsin and Putin made a major problem. Both tax reforms and tax collection systems were big. Corruption was bad under both of them as well. Okay, so understand that. And all of them, the one problem is they still weren't being able to get foreign direct investment. So understand there's a lot of similarities between them as well. Under Yeltsin and Putin, both of them corruption, tax system issues, foreign direct investment, all those things come into play. All right. The next page over on page 376 of your study guide, you have what we call the four tigers. This is one of the easier questions on the exam. They'll just say, which of the following is a four tiger, which of the following is not a four tiger. Now, the four tigers had an export promotion growth strategy. An export promotion growth strategy simply means we're going to make a product and then we're going to ship it out across our borders into other countries, whether it be shipped overseas completely or just neighboring countries. And the money is going to come into our economy from the sale of these goods. And thus we're going to stimulate our domestic economy by bringing in foreign currency. Now, whether it be indirectly tied to their currency, they're bringing in money from foreign countries into theirs. That's stimulating their economy. The ones that really started this were consistent of the four tigers. That would be Hong Kong, Taiwan, also known as the Republic of China. Don't get it confused with actual China. Republic of China, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. So note those four as the four tigers. Now, they were also known as NIEs, newly industrialized economies. Okay, we're going to talk about NIS a little bit later on, newly independent states. But newly industrialized economies, the four tigers, are all this basic same thing. Export promotion growth strategy, relying on exports to stimulate the domestic economy by having foreign money come into their domestic marketplace. Now, a lot of other countries, especially in Southeast Asia, adopted this perspective of the four tigers. They didn't do it as well or as early, but these countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam would be one of these. These are called wannabe tigers. And you'll have a question about wannabe tigers and four tigers, and you need to know the fundamental differences and the fundamental characteristics. The four tigers did it better and first, but they're all Pacific Rim type countries, some a little more industrialized than others, but they adopted the export promotion growth strategy, just some did it better than others. The wannabe tigers, once again, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, pretty much did all the same things and mimic what the four tigers did. Now, the next thing is the Latin American countries. And we're going to be talking about Brazil in a little while, but you can talk about Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Peru, Bolivia, all those different countries use the same thing. In the Latin American countries, they didn't do an export promotion growth strategy. They did an import substitution growth strategy. And in this import substitution growth strategy, they stimulated the domestic marketplace by raising barriers to trade on imported goods. Now, we're going to use the Brazilian computer market, which is a test question in and of itself, as an example of this. But what they do is they raise barriers to trade, whether that tariffs, quotas, NQNTBs could work. We're going to talk about all those specifically a little bit later on. But they give the chance for the manufacturers and the local economy to grow by eliminating competition that maybe come across from the global side rather than outside their country's borders. It does give a lot of short-term benefits to all these businesses inside the country, but the long-term effects, it hurts the economy within the system and it hurts the customers getting the best deals possible. And this comes as now we can talk about the Brazilian computer market. If you look on page 377 of your study guide, it talks about the Brazilian computer market. And you got to think of it this way. The Brazilians, because of these import substitution growth strategies and raising barriers to trade against the United States or any other computer, were able to not do as good a computer and or charge more for it. Let me give you an example of how this works. Say you're given you have the opportunity to buy a computer, laptop computer, and you can buy a US one for $300 and a Brazilian one for $350. You live in Brazil, so you can buy. They're basically the same. One's 300, one's 350. Now you can obviously want to be nationalized, and you can say, "Hey, I'm just going to buy a Brazilian because that's the way I am," or you can be like most rational people and just simply say, "You know what? I'm going to buy the cheaper one." Well, if the Brazilian government decides, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put a 20% tariff on goods entering in our country, computers entering into our country. So now that same computer the US makes with a 20% tariff or tax on it is now $360. Now you're choosing between a $300 computer that now is $360 because of the tariffs, which is US made, and a $350 Brazilian computer. Well, then you're going to pick the Brazilian computer. It's cheaper. And if they're all the same relatively in terms of quality, there you go. But the quality is going to diminish because they don't have external competition in the global marketplace because they've enacted barriers to trade. So now the Brazilian computers can say, hey, we don't have competition. Let's raise our prices. So they raise their prices, $355, $360, $365, $370. All of a sudden now they're $370, and okay, the US computer, even with the tax, is now cheaper. So the Brazilian computer people, they just go and tell the government, hey, raise it to a 30% tariff. Brazilian computers are now, the Brazilian government raised it from 20% to 30% tariff. Now it's $390 for the US computer. $370 is what it was going for Brazil. You start buying Brazilian again. And you just keep repeating this process. And now you're taking a $300 computer, which was just as good, and now you're having to pay $390 or $385 or $390 for something equivalent. So it's hurting the domestic economy in this way long term. A lot of the countries that did this import substitution growth strategy by enacting barriers to trade, whether it be a tariff or a quota, an NQ/NTB, which is a non-tariff, non-quota system, were from Latin America: Chile, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Bolivia. That's all on page 377 of your study guide. Okay, they tried to open up their economies later on when they realized this import substitution growth strategy did not work. Now, another term that you're going to have in chapter 16 that goes along with the import substitution growth strategy is the beggar thy neighbor policy. Now, we're going to talk about that when we talk about chapter 16, because that's where it is. But you need to also mimic or add to it the information about import substitution growth strategy as well. It's going to be fundamental on the exam also. Now, one of the other things I've heard about is something about copper. And I don't know how the question was phrased, have no idea. Somebody just said they had a copper question on their exam. It may have just been a storyline and you used copper, but in your study guide on the bottom of page 377, it talks about commodity prices in the mid-2000s helping economies. Argentina with the food products, Brazil food products, Bolivia natural gas and tin. There's Chile and copper. I don't know if it's a storyline about copper or not, but if you are going to guess between those countries, if it is something about copper, Chile. If you're talking about gas and oil, Bolivia, Mexico, Venezuela are all in that gas and oil thing. So then you would choose which one does not apply. Okay? But understand all those are the more Latin American countries that went from an import substitution growth strategy to eventually changing it once they realized it wasn't working. Okay. That is it for the pages up to 377 in your study guide. Now, the next few things that we're going to talk about are really going to be more along the lines of terms. And if you can just memorize a term and be able to apply it to a given situation, you're in good shape. The first one is fixed versus flexible. And this is talking about exchange rates. If it is fixed versus flexible, the different type of exchange rates, they have pros, they have cons associated to it. The first thing we're going to talk about is flexible. The dollar is flexible, the euro and the EU is flexible and stuff like that. It used to be fixed. In fact, I think there's a question in the global A, where it talks about the euro is fixed and the dollar is flexible. They're both flexible now, and I might not have been able to change that question because I know global A is one that I've lost the zip drive. Well, actually, probably a floppy disk from when I made them so long ago. So I can't fix that one unless I retype it out. So there's one question, I think, global A, fixed versus flexible. The euro used to be fixed. It is now flexible. And that's been a question as well. The euro was fixed. It's now flexible. The dollar has always been somewhat flexible. Now, what does it mean by flexible? It means the value of a currency is going to change over time due to supply and demand of that currency on the foreign exchange market. Now, we have foreign exchange markets like Tokyo, you have Sydney, Australia, you have the United States and New York and all that stuff, London. You have a bunch of different exchange markets for currency itself. And that's at the bottom, London, New York, Tokyo right there, other traders in Sydney, and the ones down at the very bottom, page 378. But these things are going to trade currency just like they'd be trading bananas or any other future pricing or copper or oil or whatever. The supply and demand dictates the value of the currency on the open market. Okay? Now, the British pound is an example. The dollar is an example. The euro is an example. Remember that the British don't use the euro, and with Brexit, they're leaving the EU eventually anyway. But you got all that stuff. The other one is a fixed exchange rate. And if you look, that is on the bottom of page 379. Okay? Now, one thing before about day trading and trading of the established currencies, it leads to very difficult to do because it leads to wild fluctuation. It says hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. That's on the middle of page 379. That applies to any day trading. You might have had some day trading questions on chapter 10 on your last test, 1 or 2. Wild fluctuations. Currency market is no different really than the securities market in regards, other than we're talking at the global level. All right. The next thing we have is fixed exchange rate. And that is where the government ties a specific currency to another currency. Now, whether that currency is also fixed or flexible is irrelevant. If you tie your currency to an exact percentage, like 3 yen equal $1, or 18 pesos equals $1, or something like that. If you're doing it that way, that is much more fixed. Okay, the government promises to hold its value of its currency to some other major currency. That'd be the British pound, the euro, the dollar especially. Okay, some examples are here: Panama, the Bahamas, Oman, all tie theirs to the US dollars. The former French colonies in Africa tied directly to the euro. So let's use the Bahamas as an example, okay? I don't know what their currency name is, but we're going to call them Bahama bucks because my kids love it. So say that the Bahamian government decides that they're going to say for every 6 Bahama bucks equals $1. Now the dollar is going to fluctuate, supply and demand, flexible exchange rate in the international currency market, you know, with London, Tokyo, New York, all that stuff. Okay, but the 6-to-1 ratio will stay the same. So yes, will the dollar, you know, if it goes up, will it also make the Bahama bucks go up as well? Theoretically, yes, but it will be tied to a specific thing. So the 6-to-1 ratio will stay consistent. All right, that is something you need to note as well. Okay, that's fixed exchange rate. Most all the major ones use a flexible exchange rate system. Fixed, no, Panama, Bahamas, Oman are examples that were tied to the US dollar. French colonies in Africa are tied to the euro. It was just simply said, in a fixed exchange rate system, which of the following is not tied directly to the US dollar in terms of the government's holding its currency to another major currency? Well, if he's asking you which one's not tied to the dollar, the former French colonies are associated to the euro, and vice versa. Okay. The next thing is, I think everybody knows what export and import is, so I'm not going to go over the export and import. You can read over the pros and cons of those, so I'm not going to get into big time there. But remember, export, promotion, growth strategy, you send the goods out, money comes in. Importing, if we were talking about taxes for import substitution, growth strategy as well. Now, on page 381 of your study guide, you have a bunch of little things that are what I consider to be the itty bitties, that are little terms or things that are found in the study guide that you might want to note for exam purposes. First of all, we need to know what the difference is between foreign portfolio investment and foreign direct investment, FPI, FDI. He likes to use a lot of acronyms on this exam. So if you're one of those people that likes to do note cards, not only for chapter 14 do you have some acronyms, not only for chapter 12 with FLSA, Family Medical Leave Act, ADEA, AEA, all those things, but you also have some in this one as well with FPI, FDI. Now, FPI is foreign portfolio investment. What that means is you are not going to actively participate in managing or controlling the company, and you're just putting in your portfolio. Now, in the United States, the SEC has a distinction. If you own 10% or more of the voting stock, that is considered to be foreign direct investment. If you own less than 10% of the voting stock, it's foreign portfolio investment, meaning it's just a part of your portfolio. You're really not actively managing, participating from an SEC perspective, from a United States perspective. Now, foreign direct investment means you're actively participating in the government or actively participating in the other currency or the other investments. So if, say, a U.S. business was to have FDI into an Italian hotel chain in Italy, then if they are a foreign direct investment, that means they have control over the aspects of it. If it's FPI, that means they're just trying to hope that the Italian hotels do a good return on investment and they make the money on their portfolio. Okay? Now, we use a distinction of 10%, although it's just really more control aspect of the 10% would be the U.S. thing. All right. The next thing is, and that's on number on page 381, number 4, up towards the very top. Now, the next thing you need to know is Caterpillar, which we'll come to in a bit later on, and stuff like that. But you have Cadbury and Toyota as an example there. All right. The next thing on page 381 of your study guide, you have some statistics. Okay. And I don't think you're going to need to know specific numbers. I think you do need to know trends and just understand that. All right. For foreign portfolio in 2011, and this is 7A1. If you look, foreign portfolio in 2011 estimated by Americans in foreign investment was 11 trillion. Foreign portfolio in 2011 by foreigners in the U.S. was estimated 12.4 trillion. So FPI by foreign-based companies is greater than FPI by U.S.-based companies. Okay? So if you want to look at it statistically, and this is just a general rule, the FPI by foreigners in the U.S.-based companies, i.e. not actively participating, is greater than U.S. businesses investing portfolio-wise and not actively participating in companies overseas or outside the United States borders. Okay? So understand that. FPI is greater for foreign than it is for America. Then you look at foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment by Americans into other companies overseas is 4.7 trillion. This is the bottom page 381 of your study guide. And then FDI for foreigners in US-based companies is 2.9 trillion. So here's the way I like to do it. I like to say FPI foreign, so FPI and then put a little F at the bottom of that, is greater than FPI US, and then FDI foreign is less than FDI US. And if you think about it and remember it that way, I don't think you need to know the numbers and just understand that. So if you know what foreign portfolio versus foreign direct investment is, actively participating control, the 10% plus rule in terms of America, and then also you know that we have more FDI than foreigners do, they have more FPI than we do, then that gives you the general trends on page 381 of your study guide. All right, the next page over is the different types of international business. Now, here's the thing. In the back of your study guide, which there's many, many questions, if you look at licensing, franchising, management, contract manufacturing, joint ventures, those 5 on page 382 and the top of page 383, okay, all that stuff right there, if you need to know the exam questions, has been on the test. Oh, by the way, there's that Caterpillar I was telling you about for FDI. I would note that. That's at the very top, page 382. I always seem to skip that. I think there's one question on Caterpillar. There's 2 different times Caterpillar's on there. If you look at Caterpillar on top page 382, it's also midway bottom of page 383, where Caterpillar relies on FDI, exporting, and franchising. I would note that line right there on page 383. I don't want to skip it because it has been a question before. All right, so the 5 different international forms of business: licensing, franchising, management, contract manufacturing, and joint venture. You need to be able to recognize when each one is being used. The first one is licensing. It's when you permit a firm in a foreign country to use your intellectual property, whether that be copyrights, trademarks or something like that to allow them to use it in whatever services or goods that they're selling. And the example there was the NBA logo and stuff like that being able to be used by a Dutch company. If you're giving them the rights to do so and they're paying you for a royalty payment, then that's an example of licensing. Franchising is when you allow a foreign firm to use your brand name or operating system in their business plan in terms of royalty payment. So the fundamental difference between licensing and franchising is licensing is intellectual property, franchising is brand name or operating system. Okay, and that'd be any kind of franchise: Pizza Hut, McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Wendy's, Burger King, all are examples. I think it's fairly self-explanatory between all these, and hopefully you'll get one or two on the exam because I think these are the easier questions. The difference between a management contract and contract manufacturing. A management contract is, say, Hilton, because there's an example of Hilton. Hilton decides they want to start up a hotel in Italy. Now, if they want to buy up a hotel and then run it, there's one of two ways they can go. They can bring all the U.S. workers that they want over to run it the Hilton way in Italy. Whatever the Hilton way is, they bring the U.S. people over and they run it. Or they can have Italians run the hotel in their own country on behalf of them by entering into a management contract with, say, an Italian firm. Now, what do you get? If you bring in your own people and bring them overseas, they obviously understand the Hilton, but they may not understand the culture. The Italian people are going to understand the culture and how hotels and tourism works in Italy and are maybe better suited to do that. If you decide to do it to where you have the foreign business, the foreign company, run your business in a foreign country for you, that is a management contract. Contract manufacturing is when you send out basically the raw materials, someone makes the goods for you in another country, and then ships the goods back to you, and you sell them. And this is an example of like Nike in Vietnam and Indonesia and stuff like that. They send the raw materials over, they get cheap labor in Vietnam, Indonesia, they bring it back over and sell it for a tidy profit. You don't have to pay the exorbitant American labor costs associated to it. Now, for contract manufacturing, that is different than an export promotion growth strategy. Remember, an export promotion growth strategy is, say, if it was Indonesia or Vietnam, one of the wannabe tigers, if they were to make the product and then ship it out, the raw materials aren't coming over, being manufactured and going back out. They're making the product and then selling it. So they're doing their own raw materials. They're not being brought in by the other company. So note that as well. Nike is an excellent example, and it's at the bottom of page 382 of your study guide as well. The next thing is international joint venture. A joint venture, when we talk about international, is going to be probably one firm from one country and another firm from a different country are going to band together. Okay, it's not a merger, it's not an acquisition. Acquisition would be saying a U.S. company completely acquiring the Italian company. A merger would be the Italian and American company merging together. In a joint venture, the U.S. company is separate, the Italian company is completely separate as well. They end up joint venturing, combining to make another company that they work in tandem with one another. And it could be in one of the host countries and or it could be in a third country. So say an Italian company and a U.S. company decide to make a third company separate from each other, but they're combined together and they run it in England, okay? That would be a joint venture. The U.S. company has its own still U.S. company. The Italian company has its own Italian company. They have formed together a third company that is going to do business in England. If they do business in England, that is what we call a joint venture. They share the risk, they share the reward, they share the control, and however they decide to do that. Okay? There you go. Anyway, Ford Motor Company relies on FDI as its primary means of international commerce. Ford U.S. automobiles are made in U.S. Ford automobiles or European automobiles are made in Europe. So therefore, they do the international commerce very much on FDI, foreign direct investment. And then Boeing does exclusively exporting. Caterpillar relies on FDI, exporting, and franchising. That little 6A, B, C. I've heard of Ford Motor Company. I've heard of Caterpillar. Boeing is an example as well, but I definitely have heard of Caterpillar. I think I made on, in your packet, I did 10 questions, I think, on chapter 14, and I did 10 questions on chapter 15 and 16. I think one of them on Caterpillar is in that grouping. I didn't go over those questions because I don't get any response from y'all doing the videos, so I just figured y'all could do them on your own. All right. On page 383, that's the rest of page 383. I don't think we need to worry about the growth at the very bottom of that portion of it as well. All right. The next thing that we have is there's not too much I've heard on page 384, your study guide being on there, but the very top of page 385, there's something that half the time I forget about, and it's on the exams. It is the law of one price. And I think it's self-explanatory what it says. The price of a good in the long run must be equal in all markets except for the cost of getting the good from one market to another, i.e. the transportation cost. So the law of one price simply says the market will eventually correct itself globally, and the only difference between price A for company A's bananas and price B, or the other price of company B's bananas in two different countries, is really going to be transportation costs. That is going to be the fundamental difference. Now, there's a wheat example on page 385, but I would note the law of one price. The price of a good in the long run is going to be equal in all markets except for transportation costs, getting the good from point A to point B. That's going to be the only difference, okay? Meaning the good itself is going to be roughly the same in terms of value and price. The transportation costs could increase the overall price of a good from point A to point B, depending. All right. The law of comparative advantage, I haven't heard about that being on any exam. It used to be in chapter 1 in the old book. I mean, even before SWIM, so you did have comparative advantage on an exam before, but I haven't heard about that being on the test very much in the past. Okay, the last thing that we need to go over before we do trade barriers is free trade versus fair trade. What does it mean by free trade versus fair trade? Free trade means very little or no government involvement in the interaction of the marketplace. So if the government doesn't do any tariffs or quotas or doesn't get involved in barriers to trade in any way, shape, or form, and they allow the free market to conduct itself and work itself out, that is going to be much more free trade system. Now, an export promotion growth strategy usually would utilize a free trade system. Now, if you have an export tax, we'll talk about exporting taxes a little bit later on, you are getting the government involved. Now, fair traders believe that the government, the national government for whatever country we're talking about, should actively intervene in international commerce, international business. They should ensure that domestic companies are not getting screwed over, that they can receive their fair share, all that stuff. So they're going to protect the domestic industry by enacting likely barriers to trade. And all it simply means, free trade versus fair trade, is does the government get involved? If the government doesn't get involved, you're looking for the term free trade. If the government gets involved, you're looking at fair trade. Now, with fair trade, any kind of government subsidy, tax incentives, eminent domain issues that could come about, tariffs, taxes, quotas, NQNTVs that we're going to go over, all of those are different ones right there that you need to know for test purposes, would all use a fair trade system because the government is getting involved in those things. Government subsidy, tax breaks, tax incentives, tariffs, quotas, NQNTVs, all require that the government get involved. Therefore, we're talking about fair trade is existing. An import substitution growth strategy, these barriers to trade, would be a fair trade system. The government is actively participating or working in that system. So an import substitution growth strategy, if it's being utilized, is also using a fair trade system, and you need to note that as well. And then from chapter 16, you also have beggar thy neighbor policies as well. All right. One of the last things that we have left from chapter 15 is the barriers to trade. There are three types of barriers to trade, or three groupings of barriers to trade. The first one are tariffs. Tariffs are simply taxes. Taxes on goods or services that are being traded internationally. If you're going to put a tax on goods entering into your country, that is an import tariff. That is the most common one you're going to have. And if he has a question that says, which is the most common tariff found, it's going to be an import tariff. If he has an export tariff, that is goods exiting the country you pay a tax on. Now, you don't have to have that. And if you don't have it, it may be more free trade, i.e. the wannabe tigers don't tax anything going outside their country. that's going to be no taxation on it, free trade. If you are going to have a small tax on it when it leaves a country and goes into another country and the money comes in, that is going to be an export tariff, an export tax, so to speak. That is going to be involved, a tax is going to involve fair trade. All right? A transition tariff or transit tariff will be when a tax on a good that goes from point A to point B, but uses the infrastructure within a country in which A is the original destination and B, final destination. It's not one of those two countries. So say if we didn't have NAFTA, we have NAFTA, but just as an example. If a good was going from Mexico all the way to Canada and it was being driven on a truck, it would go through all the U.S. infrastructure. You'd use a highway system, you'd use a trucking system, all that stuff. If the United States wanted to place a tax on that good, even though it's leaving Mexico and entering into Canada, it would be a transit tariff. Now, if it left Mexico and went to Canada and Mexico put a tax on it, that'd be an export tariff. If it left Mexico and went to Canada and Canada put a tax on it, that would be an import tariff, the most common. If the U.S., because of the infrastructure, put a tax on it, that would be a transit tariff. So if Mexico, and if it gives you a storyline about going from point A, one country, to point B, another country, and using other countries' infrastructures. And then if he says country A, the original country, places a tax, the final destination country places a tax, or the country that utilizes the infrastructure places a tax, you need to know all three of these: import, export, and transit. Ad valorem is placed upon tax based upon the good's value. Whatever the value is, you pay a tax on it. So if it's $2 million, you pay like a 2% tax or something like that. A specific tariff is going to be based upon the unit, pounds, ounces, whatever it could be, the unit, bushels, whatever unit you're using, you're going to pay a tax based upon a per unit basis. Now, compound is a combination of specific and ad valorem. Its value and unit is going to make a compound tariff. Okay, so note that, and do not think that a compound tariff is an export and import combined together. It is a transit. It is an ad valorem and specific tariff combined together. Okay. Now tariffs are going to be a major source of revenue, whether it's import, export, okay, transit, even ad valorem, specific, compound. Any of those can be used. You need to be able to recognize each of those tariffs being used in a given situation. Now, the next one is quotas. Quotas is just a numerical limit on how much of a good can be imported or come into a country from a foreign country itself. And so if we were using that Brazilian computer, if the Brazilian government would just say no more than 10,000 computers from the United States can come in a given year, then that is going to be an absolute quota. They're only going to allow a specific quantity in. After that, no more is allowed in. That is an absolute quota. Now, a tariff rate quota is slightly different. It's when there is no final absolute, and depending on how many they let in, the tax rate changes. So for the first 1,000 that come in, it may be a low tariff or tax, only like 3%. Then the next, from 1,001 to 5,000 computers that come into Brazil would be taxed at 7% tax rate. Then after 5,001 to say 15,000, it would be an 11 or 19%, 11% tariff. And then anything after 15,000 would be at like 20%. So it goes up based upon the numerical limit. Okay, so you just have to ask yourself, if given this storyline, and he goes, okay, Brazil places a 3% tax on computers coming into the country. The next set of computers goes over the threshold they allow, and they allow them in at a higher rate, a higher tax. This would be an example of a tariff rate quota is what you're looking for. They allowed them in at a certain level, met their standard, let them in another level. If they say they are not letting any more in because they've met their limit, then we're at absolute quota. And be able to recognize the difference between those as well. All right, and then you have the sugar export example. I would look over that sugar export. I think it's one of the questions in the back of the study guide dealing with sugar, although you don't even know all the numbers and stuff, but look over that as well for quotas. All right, the last thing we have in chapter 15 that we need to go over, and I'm not even going over the questions in the back. All the questions in the back are good. and I think there's 20. Usually about 8 of those are verbatim on the exam. And then in chapter 16, about 7 or 8 of them verbatim, and then the other 9 or 10 that are on the exam in a normal semester are things that you don't have, and mainly a lot of countries. Okay, NQNTVs. These are non-quotas, non-tariffs. There are other barriers to trade. Trade barriers that don't include quotas or tariffs, taxes. Okay, and there's basically, if you've got those 6 different ones right there. The first one is product and testing standards. If you think about it, the U.S. with the USDA, the FDA, we have product and testing standards. If they don't meet a certain threshold, i.e. nutrition and labeling, education, stuff like that, or in terms of drug testing, they don't have FDA approval, they're not going to be allowed into the country. If they don't meet the testing standards of the administrative agency of the United States, they won't be allowed into the country. That is a product or testing standard. It's not a quota, it's not a tariff, it's just another way to keep the foreign goods out. An example there is Japan. We're going to come back to that in a little while. Then you have public procurement. The way public procurement works is if a company gives a government gives a certain percentage to a host business. For example, so say you're building an apartment complex, and you're building it in Brazil, and you have a Brazilian company that says we can do it for $3 million, and a U.S. company says we can do it for $2.9 million. Well, that's $100,000 savings. If both companies are, qualities of work is the same, you would normally pick the $2.9 million and save yourself $100,000 in making that apartment complex. But if the government of Brazil has like a 10% public procurement, what they're saying is if the Brazilian thing is within 10%, then you go Brazilian. So if 10% of 3 million would be 300,000. So if the U.S. one is above 2.7 million, you got to go Brazil because the public procurement says an extra 10%. Okay, so the U.S. one would have to be significantly cheaper for it to be work, and that stimulates the domestic economy by getting the Brazilian workers to work on that apartment complex. But it also hurts because you don't get the lowest bid because of this public procurement. Local purchase requirement requires a minimum percentage of the final product to be from local content. We'll come back to this in chapter 16 as well, but 60% of the programming on French TV and radio must be part of Europe, and at least 40% of the French in origin. The next one is access to distribution systems. This is where they do not allow you to get foreign businesses or foreign companies into their distribution system. And a perfect example, and one that's been on the test before, is the Korean domestic film market. If you look at that Korean domestic film market, it says films to be shown in Korean films that are domestic must have a minimum of 146 days per year. Now, if you got a movie like Parasite, which I thought was pretty good, being in a movie theater for 146 days, okay, fine. But the problem is if you have bad movies. Think about it in the United States. If you had a bad movie, whatever bad movie you can think of your head, and the U.S. market said whatever movie has to be in for 146 days, you're talking almost well over a third, nearly a half a year, that movie must be in movie theaters, which means other movies can't get in, even if it's foreign. So because the Korean market requires all the domestic film to be shown for a certain amount of days, it doesn't allow access to foreign films to get the screen time. That's a way to limit the ability to get into the marketplace as well. Japan and the automobile dealership did that as well. Regulatory procedures. A nation's regulatory can be based upon foreign firms. Japan, South Korea have discouraged consumption of foreign alcoholic beverages by imposing higher taxes on them than domestic goods. So you note that as well. FPI, FDI would be investment control. We don't allow ownership of the airlines to be more than 25%. Certain countries won't let certain aspects of business be under FDI control. It must be under FPI from a foreign business. So note that. But the other question that I've heard about, and I don't know how it's phrased, but he says, which of the following does Japan use as an NQNTV? And that's a kind of a tricky question, but if you look at it, if you look at where Japan is used as an example on pages 388 and 389, it's used for product and testing standards as a trade barrier, i.e. Japan. And then on the access to distribution systems, Japan and the automobile dealerships refuse to handle American cars. And then regulatory procedures, Japan discourages foreign alcohol beverages by imposing higher taxes on them. Okay? Those are all examples where Japan did. If you have a question, the Korean film market, you have the Brazilian public procurement, you have the US USDA, US FDA, but then also Japan, those three things as well for test purposes also. Okay, that should end chapter 15. Once again, I think if you can go over those 20 questions in the back of the study guide, along with the things I talked about, and do some of the questions, I think you're in good shape for chapter 15 and 16. If he goes with 25 questions, you may have all of them here in the back of the study guide. It's one of the ones where I like to pick up the best ones and say, hey, here's a way he phrased it. You might like this one. This one's almost verbatim. He may change up the multiple choice answers in terms of all that stuff, but note that. You notice that you have, for number 3, you have management contract. If you look, you also have FDI and FPI on numbers 9 and 10. But then you have questions on licensing on number 16, contract manufacturing on 19. Those are all the different types that we talked about as well. And number 14, an example of a 4 tiger. That copied the 4 tigers, that'd be the wannabe tigers. You pick out which one's a wannabe tiger. And then Cadillac teaming up, all those different things and stuff like that. Go through all of those on exam purposes. All right. Anyway, okay, that's it. I'm going to close it out, and we'll talk about chapter 16. And with chapter 16, we will fill out the chart that is in your packet on the very back page, as well as make another chart, because chapter 16, it's terms and countries and trading blocks. And it can be sucky to know all the stuff, but we'll talk about that in the